We're going to bind the neck of our baby doll A-line smock dress. So if you remember, when we were drafting our pattern, we measured sorry, let me see them in the right place. We measured the neckline, which was 11 centimeters. We measured that little gap from where we cut away the armhole, that was 3 centimeters. We measured, that was on the front, and then on the back, the other little gap, which was 1.5, and then the back neckline, which is 7.4. So what I've done is I've transferred those measurements onto my binding. Okay, so to equate to that, and I'll just move this down so hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so here's my binding. Okay, so this is a piece of bias bindings. It's a piece of fabric cut on the bias, and it's 4 centimeters wide, and that allows for a 1 centimeter seam allowance and then a 1 centimeter finished binding edge. Okay, so I've notched my center front, and then I've notched the, so basically that's the halfway point of my binding. Okay, so that's my center front. Then I've notched 11 centimeters to equate with the 11 centimeters here on the neckline, so that will match up to that when that is sewn on. Then I've notched 4.5 centimeters, so that equates for the 3 centimeters here, and then the 1.5 centimeter here on the back. And then I've notched 7.4, which equates to here. And then I've left a little bit of seam allowance here on the end where we're going to box off the edge of the binding, and we'll use a little hook and eye to actually close it at the centre back neck. So I've basically done that on both halves of my binding. So if I fold that in half, you can see my centre front point, my 11 centimeters then here to fit across each half of my front neckline, 4.5 to fill in the gap on the shoulder, and then the 7.4, which is the back neckline. So obviously these measurements are specific to my pattern, and I've measured them from my pattern, so it is all relative to your individual pattern. Okay, I've purposely only notched one side of the binding. That's the side that's going to get machined on, because the other side here is going to get hand stitched on, and you have to fold that in by hand. So it's just much easier if you don't have it nipped into. Okay, so that's why I've only notched one side, and I've just done with a little pen to make it easier for you to see on camera. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew that onto the actual neckline of our dress. Okay, so I pressed my armholes after I did my back row, so as you can see they're all sitting really nice and neatly. And then the other thing that I did was I just did a little line of stitching around the neck to hold the fabric and the lining together. So that's on the back neck, the front, and then the other half of the back. So next I'm going to pin my binding into place. Alright, so with the right side facing, I have a little tiny notch in the center front of my dress. I literally folded it in half and just did the tiniest little notch, because obviously we're not using much seam allowance here, so don't do a massive big notch down the center front of your dress. The other thing you can do now is you can actually trim off that excess seam allowance. That's just from where we finished our armholes, and on the neck at the back, that can all just get trimmed off, and just tidy that up a little bit as well. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this around so you can see better what I'm doing. So there's my center front, and then there is the center front of my binding. So that's going to get pinned to there, like that. So my center front is getting pinned together. Then there's the first notch, which represented the first 11 centimeters. So that gets pinned. So what I'm trying to do here is pin it so that it's, the seam allowance that I'm going to get taken off is about 1 centimeter. So my notch has to line up with 1 centimeter down on the neckline. Now the fact that it's bias, it has that little bit of stretch in it, which is perfect. It's what we need. Okay, gets pinned into place, and then the same on the other half of the front neck. Okay, so I'm pinning that in line. So it looks like I'm not quite pinning it up to the edge, but what I'm doing is I'm taking into consideration that I'm going to be sewing a centimetre off, so my notch needs to be in line with the centimetre, because that's where I took my measurement from. Just making sure everything's sitting nice and neat. And now this bit, this is where we leave the gap, okay, because obviously there was a gap on our pattern. So there's our 4.5. So the back piece now gets put at the 4.5, okay, and it's the binding that fills in that gap on the shoulder, and then the last piece fits around the back neck. Okay, so just make sure that it's sitting as nice and neat as you can. Okay, and then the same here. So this is the other back. So again, the gap of 4.5 in place. I had done a little notch by mistake, so I'm ignoring that one. I'm going to my second one, and as you can see, that's what that's going to look like there. And that's just sitting nicely over the edge there to allow me a little bit of seam allowance to box in the edge of my binding. Okay, so we need to just sew that on. So what I've done here actually as well, just to point out, on the back along the zip, I folded my lining in, my seam allowance in my 1.5 before I stitched across here, so that all of this is going to sit nice and neat when it's binded. Alright. Just make sure you're not just sitting bang on your centre back neck, and as I say, we're only taking a centimetre seam allowance. And I'm making sure to keep my binding along the edge of my dress, the edge of the neckline, and only sew off the 1.5. When you get to the gap, you can actually just sew straight across, because it'll help give a little bit of stability, even though you're not actually sewing the binding to anything. So it's really important to keep the binding exactly in line the edge of the dress, of the neckline. So we're just coming across the centre front, and I'm barely even taking the 1 centimetre seam allowance. And again, making sure to keep the binding in line with the edge as I move along. And here I've come to the other gap. So I'm just going to go straight across. That'll help stop it stretching when it's actually been worn as well. It'll act as a stay row. And again, my lining was folded in along the zip. The next thing we're going to do is actually box out those corners, okay? So a little bit tricky, but it'll be worth doing. So fold the seam allowance down like that, okay? So I folded my seam allowance down. Fold your binding like that. So my seam allowance is facing down out of the way for the moment, and then pop it back onto the machine. making sure to fold it exactly in half. And you're only going to the line of where you stitched on the binding, you're not going right through the seam allowance. I'll show you what I mean. So my seam allowance is still flapping around there. I literally stitched to that point. Okay, so now turn that back up, fold that over, and you're going to flip all that through. And there you go, you've got a nice little corner. Okay. Just do the same with that on the other side. So just to show you what I did again, seam allowance gets folded down that way to get it out of the way. Fold the binding down in half and then stitch that corner. So fold that with your finger and then turn it through. And the seam allowance goes up inside the binding. Okay? So the seam allowance is going up inside the binding. And I'm just using the end of a pencil with no lead in it to push my corner out. Which you can also do with the edge of a pin if you want, just to get that corner out nice and sharp. Okay? So all we have to do then is slip stitch on the inside and sew a little hook and eye on there.